So Susan, I'd start with your personal prehistory, so to say. I know that before you came to Prague, you've been a member of a Unitarian congregation in Virginia in the United States for many, many years. And I'd ask, were you born into a Unitarian family, or was it your choice to become Unitarian? How was it?
It was my choice. My husband and I decided after we married that we wanted to find a spiritual community for both of us. We both had religious background in our family. In my family, many different religions. And so I was already well on my path to Unitarian Universalism. We went to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Roanoke and immediately found our home. We didn't have to look any farther. We knew right away. And also I had known about the history of Unitarian, mainly through literature, through the transcendentalists, who I had read very much of Emerson, Thoreau, and the sort of related people, Whitman, Emily Dickinson, other writers, and they influenced me tremendously. So I knew there was that connection. And also in our local Roanoke, Virginia community, they were very active with social justice, with ecology, environmental, natural themes, and so all of this brought us there, and it's the reason that we felt so comfortable immediately.
I see. And did you celebrate the flower communion in your community already at the time when you entered when you joined the community? Was it from the very start part of your Unitarian life?
Yes, it was.
Did, yeah.
Usually in May. And we celebrated it very much the same as we celebrated here in Prague, both with the International Unitarians, and I've been also to the Prague Czech Unitarian ceremony, and it's very similar. People bring flowers, contribute them to a communal vase, and then at the end, everyone takes a flower.
And do you remember when you first heard about Norbert Fabian Čapek? When was it, and in which connection? Was it with the flower communion, or was it a different occasion?
I first heard of him in relation to the flower communion. It didn't make a big impression on me. I do know that some congregations focus more on his martyrdom. And the social justice aspect, and of course, unfortunately, him dying at Dachau, and all of the meanings behind that. It wasn't until about the very end of 2016, 2017, when I started to get the idea to create artwork to commemorate the flower communion, that I did research on Čapek. I read the English language biography by Henry, and learned as much as I could about Čapek, and obviously I was impressed, and so I was motivated to continue with this idea. You have to understand, in the beginning, they're just ideas.
To me, especially calligraphy seems very similar in a way to contemplation. that you must spend an incredible amount of time working on such a calligraphic plate, and you must be very, very concentrated, because this is really a very detailed work. There are no big gestures. That's about extreme painstaking attention to every detail. So could you tell us something about that, or am I completely wrong?
No, you're completely right. Comparing it to meditation is quite accurate. There is a focus, and it's a feeling when you're really in that space. The rest of the world disappears, and the tiniest little detail in the art, or even when I'm out in nature observing nature, it's the tiniest little details that draw you in, and they take you away from our material world in a magical, perhaps mystical way. It's very hard to explain. I've heard many artists talk about it, and they all say the same thing. It's hard to explain, but it's very real, and I love that feeling. And so it's very easy for me to work at my art for hours and hours and hours on end. And during this quarantine, I have been so in my element. It has not been difficult at all for me to come in and spend time alone in my studio.
Creating such piece of art takes some kind of inspiration, of course, but also a great deal of work, simply put. How long do you actually work on such a calligraphic plate? Can you tell us?
Yeah, it's hard to know, because I spend a good bit of time doing research. And in the case of creating this piece, featuring flowers and the writings of Člověka, I spent the first 6 months when we moved to Prague, visiting botanical gardens and parks. Many of the species are quite similar to the plant species that I'm very familiar with in the States, but they're slightly different species, and so I had a wonderful time visiting the parks and botanical gardens. The botanical garden at Charles University is wonderful for research. So I did that, so 6 months, and I haven't even picked up the pen or the brush yet. And then I'll show you this, because I started working on the piece. And I reached a point, and you can see it's okay, but I was a little rusty because we moved here. I had to pack up my studio months before we moved, and then it was several months before it came, and then spending time out in the gardens. So maybe it was 6 or 7 months that I had not been doing any artwork. And I started working on this, and then I reached a point and I thought, I can do better than that. So you'll see, and I hope you'll see what I mean, the difference between the sunflower versus when I really was in my element. So in real time, it was 2 years that I dedicated.
Can you finish one piece like that? That's amazing. That's amazing. But when you look at it, you see that amount of energy, I'd say, not just work, but really energy, very concentrated energy, which has been put in there.
Thank you.
And you showed us that first, sketch, we can probably say, and then you changed a bit your concept. And so you first start with the probably pencil drawing, or you start with your watercolors right away, or how do you work technically?
Okay.
Because I see beautiful colors here.
So I almost always start with the lettering because you can make mistakes very easily with the lettering. And I use watercolors. They come out of a tube, and then I reconstitute them with water, and I just fill the reservoir of the calligraphy pen, and that's how I do the lettering. And I also then, for the flowers, I use very small watercolor brush, and this is a crow quill pen. It's stiff. It's a hawk quill, actually. It's very stiff. But this is what allows me to get the finest kind of detail, to even be able to do the thorns on the flowers or to do a hard edge. It's my favorite tool. And it also will hold the watercolors just a little bit there. And I do use a pencil. I very carefully sketch. I use math, geometry to lay out so that the 31 flowers, in this case, 16 flowers in the outer circle and 15 in the inner, and I lay that out geometrically, so that gets me in the ballpark, and then it's just a very slow process until I complete.
You did several calligraphies on Unitarian theme, actually. I have seen quotes by Thoreau, Emerson, by Walt Whitman, who's also connected to Unitarianism, and all of these are on flower motifs, which is not the only motif you follow in your work, or you've been following in your work. Is it that somehow those flower motifs came with the Unitarian inspiration, or was it first flowers and then Unitarianism, or how was it?
I think this is the interdependent web in action, because it's not just one or the other, it's that they're all connected. And the writings of the transcendentalists, the connection with nature that they emphasized in their writings, all of this attracted me and continues to be a very great interest to me, that connection to nature. And then also behind it, and this is important as well, it's not just the connection to nature, it's a social responsibility then to act responsibly towards nature and towards the world that we live in and the universe.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're talking about that, because I think that in Czech Unitarianism, that heritage of transcendentalists is not really much frequented or perhaps much known. So I think that's very important that you are connecting that idea of Čapek's flower communion to those old sources of Unitarianism, or of one very important line of Unitarianism in American transcendentalism.
Yes, and especially the relationship between Čapek, the flower communion, the Unitarian Universalist world, and the world at large. It's really evolving for me. And it feels like we are at a time in our history where it's just very, very important that we all make this connection between the natural world, our responsibility to it, and where, as human, as a species, where we want to evolve and go with the modern world that we've created.